telling him to sort of go back up and recount the prayers. So these are just some of the images, of course, the Kaaba. And this, of course, lays the foundation for the later literature that is associated with the extolling of Jerusalem. There's an entire literature that's built, particularly around the period of the Crusades, which talks about the virtues of cities, and particularly the virtues of Jerusalem. And so much of this material comes from this period. There we are. Finally, I just wanted to show you that in thinking about Dante, the question of direct textual influences or not, there are certain things in the zeitgeist, in thinking about and in writing, I'm sure for Dante, his work, the comedy. And so, if a German Fleisch Extract, if they were some commercial company was able to take the image of Muhammad's nocturnal journey in Ascension and put it as a label for essentially, I think, lard of some form, you can imagine that that notion of the nocturnal journey has been associated and has been part of the European imagination for quite a long time. And I would make the argument that Dante was not an exception. Thank you.
Our last speaker this morning will be Paul Borowski. We'll talk about Dante and art, but he's, I guess, the perfect speaker to end this series, or this session. I remember now quite a few years ago, great many years ago, running into him at Alderman Library, where he was telling me that he was just up there in the stacks reading Vasari. For an art historian to read Vasari is probably not surprising. But what he kept telling me was reading Vasari as literature, not looking for factoids, which is, I guess, what I've seen most art historians do with Vasari, but trying to read Vasari and figuring out what's going on in terms of literature. And this is, of course, what marks all of Paul's work, his books on Vasari, his other books, taking literature seriously, trying to understand literature, and trying to understand how literature and art fit together. And so this morning, then, he's going to help us understand Dante and art.
You're looking at Homer, the epic poet, the author of the Iliad, the Odyssey, poems about great heroes, military heroes, Achilles, Odysseus. There's a shift when Vasari paints Dante. Dante, who said that Homer was the sovereign poet. Excuse me. Because here in Vasari's mind, in his image, Dante has become the sovereign poet, surrounded by his court, the lesser poets, Petrarch, Boccaccio, among others. Vasari, who, writing the lives of the artists in 3 parts, to which you can compare to the comedy, is the story of the journey of the artist to perfection, both spiritual and aesthetic. And this shift from the hero, the military hero, to the poet, because Dante is the subject of his own poem, is monumental, foundational for the modern idea of the artist, modern cult of the artist. Here, portrait of the Giotto, who Vasari says, in effect, is the Dante of art. The image of the modern artist, the painter, the sculptor, the architect, depends on the image of the poet. To the rescue. It's so dry in here. Let's just look at a few examples of the glorification of the artist in the wake of Dante. The self-reflexiveness, the self-consciousness of the artist. Here, Leon Battista Alberti, architect and writer, who wrote an autobiography in the 15th century. Or consider the self-portrait that Ghiberti made on his glorious door of paradise for the baptistry, where he signed the work prominently, and Ghiberti wrote about himself in his commentaries. These artists, very, very self-conscious in the wake of Dante. And here, Michelangelo portraying himself as Nicodemus in the Florence Pietà. In the 16th century, as Vasari tells us in one of his letters. Now, this image, which is cropped up over and over again, where this frog has come from, settled on the back of my throat. In the cathedral, a painting from 1465 by Domenico di Michelino, commemorating Dante's birthday 200 years earlier, shows Dante outside the city walls, the exile, who nevertheless holds up his poem. Lines of light radiate toward the city, the illumination of the city, the enlightenment to the city, while he points toward hell, into which he descended, and behind that gesturing hand, we see the mountain of purgatory, climb the mountain, paradise regained, and then the heavenly spheres. This is a gigantic fresco, very, very badly damaged, painted by Nardo Piccione in the church of Santa Maria Novella, essentially a generation after Dante's death. What is so stunning about it is that here, in just a short time, his vision of hell has informed the artist's imagination. One can barely see in this particular view the pool of blood and the violent being shot by centaurs at the bottom, and to the left the harpies and the wood of the suicide. Most of the first cantos are the upper part, and then the rest of the poem is compressed at the bottom. But I just want to show you that one red band in detail, which is the flames coming out of the tombs of the heretics, and they are identified in words. Really at the center of the composition, I cannot help but think about the fact that we are in a church of the Dominicans, who of course, are famous for their extermination of heretics. We are, quite obviously, here now in the Pope's Library. Important fact to remember at the Stanza della Segnatura, with the authors of great books here, the philosophers Plato and Aristotle, among others. Philosophy, theology, law, and poetry, a scheme of canonical authors and texts that is inspired by Dante's Limbo, where he celebrates the great poets and philosophers. If you look at Plato toward the center, gesturing heavenward, a suggestion of his transcendental philosophy, you see the comparable gesture across the room in the representation of theology, the Trinity, God the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, surrounded by saints, hierarchy of angels, and then all of these figures down below, theologians, including at the right in red behind the papal figure, wearing his laurel wreath, Dante, who significantly is the only person in the room represented twice, the exception of the Pope, the patron, which I think has resonates with the connection to Dante's limbo, great poets and philosophers and such. Rather interesting too that he's standing right in proximity to the Pope Sixtus IV, the uncle of Pope Julius II, who is himself an important theological figure. Adjacent to the representation of theology, the meditation on the sacrament, we have Parnassus, Apollo, surrounded by the muses with poets both ancient and contemporary, and conspicuously at the upper left, you see Homer reciting his poem. Behind him is Virgil pointing to Apollo, and Dante to the left looking at Virgil. So you have the kind of history of the epic. Dante looking to Virgil, who was his guide through hell. Virgil standing behind Homer. And here you can see more clearly Dante, again, looking at Virgil, who returns his gaze, and Homer chanting his poem with the young scribe taking down his words. And you can see how canonical that image of Dante has become, whether it's based on a death mask or not, whatever Dante might in fact have looked like. You see it over and over again here now in this handsome, incisive profile portrait by Botticelli, Dante with a laurel wreath. I want to turn our attention to Botticelli's responses to Dante. Botticelli, who was a close commentator on Dante, as Vasari tells us, who illustrated the poem. And you can see various episodes in Canto 21, culminating in the lower right-hand corner, a whole series of devils, this band of devils led by the well-named Malacoda, evil tail. You can think of the tail as the bottom, bad bottom, or something of that sort. Way down, I think, right here. And then I'll have an imperfect reproduction of this detail. But in any event, you can see a series of lines emanating from his, should I say, anal aperture. This is smirking at his blast at Dante and Virgil, surrounded by this hideous, ridiculous, laughable band of associates. This is Botticelli's way of translating the last line of the canto. He made a trumpet of his ass. And Botticelli, in Vasari's biography, is a man of considerable wit and humor. We move from the ridiculous to the sublime, the beloved Primavera, which resonates with the Divine Comedy, because here in this earthly paradise where the wind god on the right abducts the nymph Chloris, who's transformed into Flora, Venus, the goddess of love, beckoning us into this garden while the three graces dance, Cupid up above aiming his dart at one of them. We see Mercury gazing up, dispelling the clouds with his caduceus, so that he might rather platonically see the light of the sun. I want you to just freeze this image in your memory, the hand extending upward.
because several years later, when Botticelli illustrates Matilda discoursing on God, pointing heavenward, he is remembering the gesture he used for Mercury in a related way. And what's particularly significant is that in that long speech, she is, in Dante's words, dispelling the clouds, unclouding the intellect. And when we look at Mercury in the earlier image, remember his hand produces dispelling the clouds. Botticelli is showing us the reflection of the light of the sun to which he looks once the clouds are dispelled. Botticelli, glorious altarpiece for the Church of St. Barnabas, altarpiece in which the Virgin and Child presented to us, flanked by angels, surrounded by saints, including St. John, most significantly, to our right, whose hand gestures toward a placard where we read, Virgin Mother, Daughter of her Son, the prayer of St. Bernard at the end of Paradise. And these words are perhaps not insignificantly related to this work, carved by Botticelli's younger friend, Michelangelo, just a short time later, just right before 1500. What is so remarkable about this work, so many things fading away here, is the youthfulness of the Virgin, which amazed contemporaries. They could not explain it. The biographers, both Vasari and Convivi, she's the mother, and yet she's so young. A contemporary poet came along and suggested that what Michelangelo was doing was representing mother and daughter at once. The analogy to Jesus as Father, God as Father and Son. That is the poet's interpretation. I hazard to guess that this was actually Michelangelo's intention, that those words are embedded in the mystery of this figure, which is eternal, essentially, timeless, transcends time, who is both maternal and filial. And the poet also suggests is the spouse of Jesus, as if we have even more mysterious unity of all three. And I think that that's distinctly possible. Michelangelo, several decades later, representing the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, Jesus, the judge, with his right hand, raising the dead who, blessed, will ascend on our left side, and then looking down toward hell on his sinister side, the left, where Michelangelo has represented two different cantos, two different moments in the poem, cantos 3 and 5, in an image which, by the way, Vasari gives a kind of Dantesque flavor to in his description when he quotes Dante. He said, the dead seem really dead, and the living seem truly alive. This astonishing apparition that one beholds in the chapel. To the left, we see Charon, the boatman, driving the sinners hellward, and on the right, Minos, coiled in serpents, below the flames of hell. Let's look a little more closely at Charon. Dante talks about his eyes burning like embers. Hard to translate that in visual terms, but there is this astonishing intensity in his eyes. If I could bring back the Botticelli drawing of the devils, you see a kind of affinity to the fierceness. And here on the right side, Minos surrounded by a number of demons who are definitely judge of hell, contrast to Minos, to Jesus on high, the judge of the ultima judicia. Michelangelo, as a great Dantista, embellishes Dante. Minos in Canto 5 is the realm of the lustful, because, in perhaps not an appropriate way, he has a serpent rising up and munching on his genitals, which would be, I suppose, in Dante's mind, or Michelangelo's mind, a fit punch for the lustful. Now, there's a story that was told in a Venetian joke book that Vasari appropriated, which is of interest here. According to the story, a papal functionary attacked the fresco because of the nudity. Because remember, we're in the period of the Counter-Reformation, and there was a great deal of controversy about Michelangelo representing nude figures. And he suggested these figures are more appropriate in a brothel or a tavern. Michelangelo was infuriated, according to the story, and painted him into the fresco as Minos, as if to say to him, "Go to hell!" And he sent him to hell. This papal functionary was himself a judge, by analogy to Minos or to Jesus, a judge of art. And what's interesting is that he has the ears of an ass, which makes us think of Midas, who was a judge who made a terrible mistake when he thought Pan was superior in his music making to Apollo. And so thought arises that Michelangelo is making a kind of allusion to a verbal pun when he conflates and condenses Minos and Midas. And some years later, Michelangelo is involved in the manufacturing of a medal that was, to celebrate himself, it was made by a friend by the name of Leone. And you can see here that we have the initials of the person who actually struck the medal, and O for opus or opus, the maker of the work. A profile portrait of the aged Michelangelo is identified with words and image, modeled on the convention of images of the ancient emperors. So Michelangelo is, in this own sublime image, exalted now to the status of somebody like a ruler on the one side, but on the obverse, we have a humble pilgrim, whether he is literally a portrait of Michelangelo or not, certainly spans for Michelangelo. And then the words, Docevo, Nikos, these are from the penitential Psalm 51. I will teach transgressors thy ways, and sinners shall be converted unto thee. Here we have Michelangelo referring to a penitential psalm in the spirit of his own penitential poetry, which was very important to Dante in Purgatory, along with many of the other psalms. So there's a gesture back toward Dante in one respect, and certainly also in the image that stands for Michelangelo as he journeys toward God by his identification with Dante as pilgrim. You know, it's one thing for a painter to portray Dante, or for a painter to picture Dante's hell, or to put the words of Dante into a painting. But Michelangelo, the superintendent of the making of this proposing to be or become or be Dante. It's a kind of almost existential desire. Now, he wrote in one of his poems about Dante, "Would that I were he." And in another poem on Dante, he wrote, "No greater man was ever born." Thank you.
We have some time for questions. Would our three speakers come to table? We can entertain some questions. Well, I have a question to start things off for Bill. I recall way back in the old days when the third volume of John Chardy's translation of the Divine Comedy came out, and the reviewer said Chardy obviously lost interest. He was out of steam by the time he got to the Paradiso because he was so lively and real in the Inferno, and now this is so pale. It strikes me, it's like the problem a painter has trying to paint a clear glass or something. How do you write about something like heaven? It seems to me that the problems Dante had trying to do what in effect was pure theology, does make that the hardest of the three Catholics to teach, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Well, I'll go back to, Dante in Canto 1 of Paradiso. He says that he can't remember. He's been there, but it's all lost because his love outpaces his mind and memory, and so he has to write shadows. He has to write verses, not false fantasies, in order to get there. His basic strategy is moving level by level, whereby he can, at each level, he can bear a greater smile of his beloved Beatrice. That's his basic way of showing how one moves point by point to the final heaven. And another basic imagery is images out of ecstasy, where at each level he's drawn more and more out of himself. It's painful. It's like being pulled out of your skin, as the story about Marsyas challenging Apollo in Canto 1. So he too is pulled more and more out of himself as he goes. All not false fantasy. So he really doesn't tell us that he's not able to. So he has to write verse. I don't know whether that answers the question or not, but.
Yes.
In the Paradiso, I thought it was interesting the rather marked similarity to the Mahayana Buddhist Bodhisattva ideal. Do you think that's just a remarkable coincidence? You know what I'm talking about?
Well, yes. I mean, I know.
Renouncing basically salvation, for the benefit of others.
Yeah, turning aside self for something greater, and that's what makes us blessed. Just like Beatrice can look straight into the sun in Canto 1, and that's the source of her great beauty. Certainly, there are echoes with Buddhism in such a poetic move. Sure.
Professor Araki, those illustrations were fascinating.
Yeah.
Could you tell us where they come from? And what about the prohibition of representing Muhammad visually. Puzzle.
Well, let me just grab the book so I can tell you exactly where they come from. They come from medieval manuscripts, and they are collected in this one volume called The Prophet's Ascension, edited by Goldie. Yeah, they're largely from medieval manuscripts, which describe the Ascension. So these would have been manuscripts describing it, perhaps the author that I referred to of Bushevi's work, so it would be illustrated in that way. And with reference to representations of Muhammad, well, we clearly see him in some of them. And so this notion that Muhammad can't be represented in, or his image cannot be represented, well, in some places it's scratched out also. There are a few images here. So clearly there was a time, and perhaps even at the same time, where he was represented and not represented in imagery. So
Who were the illustrators? Were they Muslims?
Oh, certainly. I would imagine that they were. I don't know. Sometimes we have the names of the illustrators in the colophons. I would have to go back and look. None of them are in the sort of annotations here, but they would have been, I think, likely Muslims. Yeah.
Are these from medieval Spain? From
Oh, these would have been from, well, there are some from present-day Afghanistan, from Herat. There are some from Tabriz in Iran. There are, let's see, and they date anywhere from the 11th to about the 15th, 16th century.
So South Park was okay when they.
Possibly, yes.
Yes?
I have a question also about the illustration. I've never seen such an imaginative illustration of Muhammad's ascent to heaven. I was wondering if there's also a possibility for a reverse influence of Dante in Islamic reception of Muhammad's journey, because, I don't know, just out of curiosity.
It's a good question. I don't know. I would have to go back and see into what languages Dante was translated into, which languages Muslims spoke, possibly in the Mogul Empire, sort of the late period, but one would have to go back and check. I don't know when the first translation is into Arabic.
Michael?
Paul, I'm still seeing those glorious images that you projected. I'm thinking how some of them are inspired by the poem and some by the poet, and whether you see any contrast to draw there. You end beautifully by thinking of Michelangelo's desire to be Dante, or to be as Dante. Is there some way in which the image of the poet solves some of the problems of the complexity of representing the poem, or how would you think about such a difference?
I don't know. That's a really big question. I'm speechless. I'm not trying to diminish the, I mean, you're asking a lot of questions packed with that, I think. I think that Michelangelo stands probably for Botticelli and for Raphael, in the sense that those arts as well were trying to be like Dante. It was not simply a quotation. That the poet was glorified by Dante's decision to make the poet persona of the poem. Painters who traditionally, sculptors traditionally, as craftsmen, manual craftsmen, found in the image of the poet an idea that they could aspire to and exalt themselves by comparison to what Dante did. That's a part, I don't know, that doesn't really adequately answer your question, but that's just an aspect of it.
Yeah.
dog.
Well, probably I make the same thing of it that you do, and that it's traditional symbol of faith, Fido.
Yeah. Well, there's another traditional association, which is that St. Bernard's mother had a dream about a red and white dog
Wow.
that she would give birth to, and which is presumably why there's a dog called St. Bernard. So I wonder if that's a St. Bernard.
Well, now you got me wondering too, but I also want to just mention, by the way, that you go to the National Gallery in Washington, National Gallery of Art, see all these great exhibitions, a great collection, very quietly sleeping in a cabinet down in the basement of the West Wing at the West End. You'll see this little medal, which is so pregnant with meaning, but so unobserved. Anyway, that's interesting.
Another question?
Yeah. Yes. Also on that point, it seems like the staff that he's carrying looks sort of like a caduceus. There seems to be a little tiny road in this.
It's hard to figure out what's going on there. There's also appear to be beads, which an aid to devotion, but whether that's caduceus, well, drive up to Washington